Good evening, everyone. I'm Hunter Ohanian, and I am the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And we're very pleased this evening to have with us for our Zoom talk, Simon Baatz. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Hunter, and
How are you?
good, thank you, and thank you for having me to speak this evening. It's a pleasure to talk about the book again.
Great. We're very happy to have you here and talk about the book. So just to give some of our guests some context here, the Stonewall National Archives and Library is located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Our library is the largest LGBTQ library in the world, over 28,000 volumes. And in our archives, we have approximately 6 million pages of material, mostly from the last quarter of the 20th century until today. In addition, we do exhibitions year-round, and people can find everything about Stonewall at our website at stonewall-museum.org. And if you have not joined our mailing list, we ask that you please do that. So today is June 18th, and we are in about the third month of a national pandemic. Our leaders at this point, June 18th, 2020, and our leaders at this point are now telling us that it's now time to come out of this pandemic, and they're actually urging people to get back to work. But just to put in the context of where we are today, the pandemic in the United States over the COVID-19 virus started in January. And as of today, 120,000 people in the United States have died. Nearly 500,000 people have died as a result of this worldwide pandemic. Also in the US, what we are facing right now is not only the fact that we have been through this amazing one-in-a-lifetime experience of the pandemic, and by the way, we had virtually an economic breakdown in the United States. Over 20 million people applied for unemployment benefits because the economy was, for all intents and purposes, shut down. The government actually appropriated over $2 trillion to try to help individuals during this period of time. And also, as of today, we don't have a cure, we don't have a vaccine, we have limited testing which is available. I think it's safe to say that there is possibly a lack of credibility in some government leaders about how we're going forward, but we are facing a situation literally on this day in which we hear leaders say the economy has to go back to work, and yet we're seeing areas of the country that are actually continuing to have rises in the number of COVID-19 cases. Thankfully, in New York, where Simon is, those cases have been coming down. Where I am in Florida right now, those cases are actually going up. Some say it's a result of additional testing. Many of us don't know the answers to these quick questions, but it is this situation that we're having this conversation, and it's why we're having these conversations via Zoom and through other virtual means, in that this is something that we probably would not have done through this format. But because it's difficult for individuals to travel, it's difficult for people to get around, it's important for us to actually continue to allow dialogue to actually happen. So that is the context of where we are today. Simon, you're in New York. Tell us how things are going there.
Well, I think probably everybody in New York City feels a sense of relief. I know that 2 days ago, the governor of the state said that the rate of infection in New York State is now lower than any other state in the union, which is kind of amazing. In fact, it's almost unbelievable when you think of North Dakota, Alaska. Really, New York State is lower. And also the number of deaths each day is around 27 now, which again is the lowest of any state in the union. And I just think, I know for myself, and I think everybody I know, we have a sense of relief that it's beginning to die down. But for a while, it was really horrendous. You know, the end of March, the whole of April, It was very unpleasant. And of course, even now going outside, when you see someone who's not wearing a mask, you feel this is someone who's taking a great risk. And I think the other thing, of course, is that I know that the death rate is going up in Florida. And the thing about this disease is what a tragedy it can be, even for those people who survive, that you can have the long-term effects in so many different parts of the body are just horrendous. And I think it's something to be avoided at all costs. So
yeah, it's true. And it's remarkable in our lifetimes. Both you and I have some gray hair, and but we have never seen something like this that is just so pervasive in so many ways. And it will change. It will change culture and society in many ways. And also we are at a time in which in the United States, equality is being discussed and fought about. And we've seen more demonstrations in the streets over the last 3 weeks than we have probably at any concentrated time in my entire lifetime, particularly around racial equality. And it's very possible that we actually can be getting to a point where we might see some systemic changes about white superiority in this country. But Simon, let's tell people a little bit about you. So Simon is the author of 5 books, born in London and educated in New York. You first moved to the US to study history of science at the University of Pennsylvania, where you received your PhD, taught American studies at universities in Britain before taking a research position at the History of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And then in 2006, you moved to New York, where you teach American history at CUNY. So thank you very much for being here. We're very happy to have you here. The book we want to talk about tonight, of course, is the book titled For the Thrill of It. The murder, which involved 2 gentlemen who, by all intents and purposes, were in a gay relationship, Leopold and Loeb. And in 1924, there was an awful murder that was committed of a 10-year-old boy. And these 2 lovers intentionally committed this murder. So let's start out by giving our audience a little bit of background about what actually happened, who these individuals were. They were both in their early 20s at the time. I forget their actual ages, but they were 21, 22, 23. How old were they?
One was 18 and one was 19.
18 and 19 years old. And they killed a 10-year-old boy. So give our audience an idea as to what about the factual underpinnings of what this murder was all about.
Well, first of all, this all takes place within a very circumscribed area of Chicago, south of the city, close to the University of Chicago. This all involves 3 families that are interconnected. They all live very close to each other. And one of these families, the Franks family, their child, who was actually 14 at the time, he did not come home for dinner. And he was missing throughout the whole night. The family stayed up during the night wondering where their child was. And then in the morning, someone reported the discovery of a body out south of Chicago. I want to give the 2 people eventually caught for this crime seemed to be the most improbable criminals that could have been imagined in 1924 when the crime occurred. And one of the reasons why this was such a sensation, why it kind of gripped the newspapers, not just in Chicago, but also throughout the whole of the United States, there were several reasons for this. One is that all 3 families were extremely wealthy. I think one family was worth $10 million, another family was worth $4 million. The other family, I can't remember how much, but certainly in the millions of dollars. The third thing, that they were all very prominent families in Chicago. They all held long-standing positions as pillars of the community and had been a representative of upper-class Chicago families. The eventual people who were caught and were accused of the crime were two young boys. One was 18. This was Richard Loeb, I think, was 18, and Nathan Leopold was 19 years old. The third thing why this was sensational is that both of these two boys were extremely bright. I mean, very, very, and their academic accomplishments were quite astonishing. Just to give you one fact, and I think if we have the slide, I'm not sure if we have the slide up yet of the two boys, Leopold and Loeb. Yes, there we go. Okay. So you see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is Nathan Leopold, who graduates from the University of Chicago in 1923. He was Phi Beta Kappa. He had already published 2 articles in a scientific journal before he graduated. His grades, I have his transcript, and his grades were almost always A's. And of course, the University of Chicago is one of the great universities in the United States. His companion is Richard Loeb, who graduates in 1923 from the University of Michigan. Now, Loeb had actually gone to Chicago at the age of 14. That's an amazing thing by itself. And then he graduates at the age of 18, I think it was, from the University of Michigan, and he is still the youngest ever student, the youngest ever person to have graduated from the University of Michigan in its history of 150 years. So this is quite extraordinary. I think, to put it in the background, crime in the 1920s, there was almost this universal belief that crime was almost like a hereditary thing, that if your grandparents were criminals, then their children were going to be criminals, and you were likely to be a criminal as well. And the other belief was that crime was basically a lower class thing. It was something that very poor people did. It was not something that rich people did. And so the big puzzle is, why are these very wealthy people, why are these two very, very smart, very academically bright students who are very wealthy, why are they committing these crimes? And that's perhaps the big puzzle, which has never really been satisfactorily resolved. Now, Richard Loeb graduates from Michigan and comes back to Chicago to study history, a PhD in history at the University of Chicago. And Nathan Leopold decides to stay at Chicago and go to the law school at the University of Chicago. And of course, the university is kind of linked up with all of this because it's very prominent in the south side of Chicago. And I think we can now go to the slide of the law school. And here it is, the whole university. It's quite a modern university. I think these buildings were only built in the 1890s. It was funded by Rockefeller money. And one of the paradoxes about American universities, of course, the elite universities, is that their architecture is all Gothic architecture. If you go to Yale, if you go to Penn, if you go to Princeton, it's all Gothic architecture. And at Chicago, it's all Gothic. And this seems very strange because these universities are only built, their modern campuses are built around 1900. And yet it's in conscious imitation of the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge that they adopt this Gothic style. So to get back to the crime, here are these two boys, 18, 19. They're in a relationship. And the relationship is very kind of uneven, and I'll get back to that a little bit under the questions that you might have about this. But they're in a relationship which is a very, very close relationship, and it's a relationship that's created and formed by their fantasy life that each boy has. Richard Loeb has a fantasy of being a master criminal, excuse me, and Nathan Leopold has the fantasy that he's the slave to a king. And these two fantasies kind of interlock with each other and propel their relationship forward. And the relationship of Richard Loeb, that is his fantasy of being a master criminal, is the dominant fantasy, and Leopold goes along with his fantasy, and they start out by creating a lot of small petty crimes like smashing car windows, like theft, so on and so forth. And it gradually escalates until Richard Loeb has the idea that they should murder a child. And the motive for murdering a child is first to experience the thrill of murder, and second, to make the murder as complicated as possible. So this will be a test of their genius, that they can get away with a very complicated crime that will be a sensational crime. And this will be a crime by a master criminal, which is Richard Loeb. So it's actually very, very by chance that they discovered the body. And if they had not discovered the body, I would not be talking to you this evening. And I would not have written the book, because nothing would have happened if they'd never discovered the body. But they discover the body. Somebody is walking home from work. He does the night shift. He walks past a ditch and he sees a boy's leg jutting out from a pipe inside the ditch. And we can now go to the picture, the photograph of the ditch in which the body was discovered. And you'll see this photograph.
Simon, I want to stop you. Simon, let me stop you here we're having some audio problems here. I just want to be sure that we're getting the recording here for everybody. Emery Grant, the Deputy Director at Stonewall, is here behind the scenes. Emery, everything look okay to you? Yes, okay, he says he's good. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. Sorry about that.
Good. So you'll see the picture of the ditch. This is two policemen in their uniforms looking down at the ditch. It's quite deep. I mean, I haven't seen the ditch myself, but you take it from me that it's deep. And it was purely chance that someone discovered the body at the bottom of this ditch. And you can see some of the workmen on the side looking down at the ditch as well. Now, this crime might never have been solved, because you've got the body, but you want clues to you. The only clue that the police found were a pair of eyeglasses. And again, you might be saying to yourselves, well, big deal, you know, thousands of people wear eyeglasses. The strange thing about this is that this was a pair of eyeglasses of very, very unusual manufacture. And these were eyeglasses that were made by a company in Brooklyn. And the police, after they found the eyeglasses, we can now go to the slide of the eyeglasses, which is the next slide. And you can see here the eyeglasses. These eyeglasses, when the police found them, they thought this has got to be a clue, all right? Who was wearing these eyeglasses? And they traced them to a firm in Brooklyn, and they asked the firm in Brooklyn, who have you sold these eyeglasses to in Chicago, in the Chicago area? And they had sold one pair to a woman in her 90s. Okay, well, you can count her out as a possible suspect. They had sold one pair to a doctor who happened to be in Europe at the time the murder was committed. And then eventually they trace another pair to Nathan Leopold. And they go to Leopold and they ask, well, what were you doing by this ditch? How is it that your eyeglasses have ended up at the ditch? And they didn't think that Leopold was the likely suspect, because he gave a plausible reason. He says, well, I was out bird watching. I'm an ornithologist. I must have dropped these eyeglasses the previous weekend when I was right by that ditch looking for migratory birds that were passing across the area. But eventually they keep questioning him, and he breaks down and he confesses to the murder. And they say, well, who did you do this murder with? And he names his companion, Richard Loeb. And so they and I were by the police, the thing you would do, you would call for your lawyer, okay? The families did not call for the lawyer because they had so much confidence that their boys had nothing to do with the crime. And so the state's attorney, it's not in Chicago, in Cook County, it's called the state's attorney, not the district county. So the state's attorney had these two boys and was interrogating them over the whole weekend before the families realized they needed to get a lawyer. And when they get the lawyer, they get the most famous lawyer in the whole of the United States, perhaps the whole world. This is Clarence Darrow. And we can go to the next photograph. This is my favorite photograph. This is a photograph taken during the courtroom hearing. You can see Nathan Leopold in the center of the picture. He's actually off towards the left, and he's staring directly. All three of them are staring directly into the camera as the photographer is taking the shot. So there is Nathan Leopold. In the center of the three people is Richard Loeb, and then the older person is Clarence Darrow. And Darrow was just so famous. I mean, there is no lawyer in American history who has come even close to Clarence Darrow. And his first half of his career was devoted towards defending socialist figures and also labor leaders. And perhaps his most famous case before this case was the bombing of the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times was involved in a big labor dispute, and some of the labor leaders bombed the building, and I don't know how many people were killed. I think about 12 people were killed, and Clarence Darrow was the defense attorney. Now, his career becomes a little bit quiet in those years, but then it revives in 1924 when he is hired as the lawyer for Leopold and Loeb. And you've got to remember that, of course, neither of these two boys, both of them have said they're guilty. All right, that's clear. They have no, they don't, there's nothing that says, there's no way of proving them innocent. Second thing is, there's no way that they're insane. Nobody has ever thought they were unusual in any way before this crime occurred. And so going into a jury with an insanity defense would have been hopeless. The jury would have said, no, there's no way that they're insane. They're perfectly reasonable people. They're not displaying any symptoms of insanity. So what is the defense lawyer going to do? All right, he wants to get them, he wants to avoid the death penalty. And the state's attorney, Robert Crowe, is determined to give these two boys the death penalty. So what Darrow does is something that nobody has ever done before in a court of law, at least in the United States. And he says, we're going to plead them guilty right at the beginning, and we're then going to call for a hearing to decide punishment. And we're going to argue in mitigation of punishment that these two boys are mentally ill, not insane, but mentally ill, and therefore their responsibility is less. Therefore, their punishment should be less. And now we go into the courtroom, and Darrow has the psychiatrists who are going to testify for the defense. And Robert Crowe, the state's attorney, wants to get them the death penalty. So he brings in his psychiatrists. And so you get two groups of psychiatrists, one arguing for the defense and one arguing for the prosecution. And then at the end of this, and this goes on the whole summer, it takes several weeks. I think it was about 6 weeks that it lasted. And then it comes down to the judge. There is no jury, and it's just the judge who's going to decide the sentence, right? Because this is just a hearing. It's not a trial. And then the judge at the last day decides, and he reads out his decision, and the whole country is waiting on this decision, and it's broadcast on the radio. No, I'm sorry, it's not broadcast on the radio. It's not. It was going to be broadcast on the radio, but it wasn't. And the judge says, because of their age, because they're 18 and 19, I'm going to send them, their sentence is going to be life for the, I think it was life for the murder and 99 years for the kidnapping. So they both end up with life and 99 years. And so they're sent off to Joliet Prison, and we can have a look at that. And this is a wonderful picture of an old, this prison was built in 1850. And until about 10 years ago, it was still being used as a prison. I've actually been to Joliet. I haven't been inside, but I've been outside, and it looks exactly like this now, except that there are just, the whole place is covered in razor wire, about 20 feet high. So it's pretty much impossible to get out of. So they go first to Joliet, which is a very unpleasant place. It's one of these old prisons, which is just falling to pieces and crumbling, and the cells are very small. There's no air conditioning. And Nathan Leopold is moved in 1925, so fairly soon, to the new prison, which is Stateville Prison. And we can have a look at that photograph. And you can see this is a new prison. And what to describe this is the cells are 4 stories high. You can see them in the photograph. The opening of the cells, it's all open, all right? There are no doors. All you have is the bars of the cells. And this goes all the way around 360 degrees. And in the center, you have this guard tower in which the prison guards can see into all of the cells because there are no doors. And on paper, this sounds great, wonderful, all right? How you can control the whole prison. In fact, it's a terrible prison. It's awful because what it is, it's terrible for the prison guards because you've got to imagine that each cell is full of prisoners. They can all see the prison guards and they can all see the other prisoners. Everybody can see everybody else. So what this creates is a sense of solidarity among the prisoners, and it causes a sense of vulnerability among the prison guards who are right in the center. This is the prison, the tower that you see in the center. It actually can be retracted down into the ground, so that if these prisoners did break out of their cells, presumably the tower in the center would just sort of slide down and the guards would be safe and secure. So by 1931, both Leopold and Loeb are in this prison, this new prison, Stateville. There's a whole history of them being in prison. The most striking thing occurs is, I think it's in 1935, Richard Loeb is stabbed to death in the shower by another prisoner. By 56 stab wounds in the shower, he dies. And Nathan Leopold lives out his years. He's eventually paroled in 1957. He can't live in Chicago because the press are all over him. You know, he's notorious. So he actually goes to Puerto Rico and lives in Puerto Rico. And then when he's in Puerto Rico, he meets a woman called Trudy Feldman. And we can see the next photograph. And here is Trudy and Nathan Leopold. And Leopold, of course, has got this inheritance from his father. And this money, his inheritance, has been doing very well. And so he has a lot of money. And Trudy has a flower business in Puerto Rico. So they live quite well and they spend the rest of their lives traveling around the world and basically in retirement. And that's the story of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. Quite a sensational story, as you can imagine. So I'm happy to have questions. Oh, now I've lost the sound. Hunter, I can't hear you. I think you need to, there we go.
There you go. It's so amazing to see all this and to see these images and to hear this whole story. So go back again and tell us, go back again and tell us a little bit about how the boys met.
They actually didn't meet in high school, or I don't know, they didn't meet in high school. One of them went to a school called Harvard School, which no longer exists. It's been turned into condominiums. That was Nathan Leopold. Richard Loeb went to the University School, which is a school run by the University of Chicago on very progressive lines. And so then Leopold goes to the University of Chicago first. And then the following year, I think it is Richard Loeb, or maybe it's Loeb was at the University of Chicago. They meet at the university. And they're just very, very different boys. I mean, Leopold is very studious, he's always studying, he's always getting good grades. Richard Loeb is not getting good grades. I mean, he went to university when he was 14 years old. He was not prepared for university studies, and he does very poorly in his classes. But they meet, and it's this fantasy life that each one of them has that really, you know, if you looked at both of them, you would say, what do these two boys have in common? The answer is basically nothing. You know, Richard Loeb is very gregarious, very outgoing, an extrovert, and Nathan Leopold is just the opposite. He's an introvert who spends most of his time studying and writing scientific papers. but it's the fantasy life which kind of locks them together. And that's the basis of their relationship.
So you have a section from your book I think you might be prepared to read now. I think it's around page 49 or 50 that talks about the early part of their relationship together.
Sure. Let's take a look at this. So this is page 49. First of all, I go into Nathan Leopold, then there's Richard Loeb. I can actually go on a little bit and talk about, here we go. So this is page 51, and I'll start right at the bottom. And this is when they're both at the University of Chicago, and this is the relationship. And this is actually after they got their undergraduate degrees and when they both ended back at the University of Chicago. So Richard has come back from the University of Michigan. So Nathan Leopold was also in Chicago that fall. He's doing now a law degree. He also received his degree earlier that year, and with his customary energy, he was taking 4 law courses that quarter. Nathan and Richard renewed their acquaintance in September 1923, and very quickly Nathan succumbed. He falls in love with Richard Loeb, to Richard's charm. How could he have resisted? Richard was too handsome for Nathan not to fall in love a second time, and Richard was sexually complacent, willing to indulge Nathan's desires. To his friends, Richard would boast of his sexual conquests. He claimed to have many girlfriends among the co-eds on the Chicago campus, but in truth, sex was only moderately pleasurable. Quote, I could, he confessed, get along easily without it. The actual sex act is rather unimportant to me. His indifference towards sex usually, but not always, translated into acquiescence whenever Nathan importuned him so passionately. Why refuse it when it mattered so little one way or the other? So this is really talking about the fact that Richard, and of course, you know, what I try to do as a historian is get as close as I possibly can to the reality. But at a certain point, there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, you know, you can only do that when you're actually there in 1924. But of course, it's difficult, impossible to really put this precisely. But here is Richard, who seems to be heterosexual, and his fantasy wants him to have Nathan as a companion, and Nathan is crazy in love with Richard. So Nathan wants to have sex, but Richard is kind of, you know, it's not that big a deal for him. He can have it, he can not have it, but he's giving Nathan what he wants throughout this relationship.
And you tell us about your sources for some of this insight into their personalities.
Yeah, well, I was very, very lucky because a lot of what the sources don't usually survive, and none of what I say in all of this is fabricated. This is all factually true, and it's based on the psychiatric reports. And what happened is that Clarence Darrow, the attorney, brings the psychiatrist in to produce a defense. Okay, the idea is that Darrow is going to show through science how these two boys are not responsible for their actions, or how they have reduced responsibility. So the psychiatrists produce reports that are designed to show this. And these psychiatric reports have ended up at Johns Hopkins. They've ended up at there's more reports at Northwestern University, and there are reports at the National Archives. And so I discovered all these psychiatric reports, and all of this information comes from those psychiatric reports that were done in 1924 in preparation for the courtroom hearing. So,
yes, and of course it's great to have that very unique insight to these two individuals through all of these psychiatric records, because as you attribute motives to them, many of these things are coming directly out of their own mouths, even though the book was written long after. Just remind everybody, my guest today is Simon Baatz, and we're talking about The Thrill of It, the book about Leopold and Loeb. If you have questions, just throw them into the chat or into the question answer. We'll get to them in the last 15 minutes. We'll be doing this until 7:30. So I'm not sure the exact page, Simon, but shortly after there, you talk about their trip from Ann Arbor after they had broken into the fraternity house. And before we get to the fraternity house, once the two boys became friends and developed a relationship, there were a lot of petty crimes that they had committed. There were fires and different crimes. What did you discover about the interaction between those crimes and the relationship between the two individuals?
Well, I think what you can get from the psychiatric reports is that these crimes were sexually exciting to Richard Loeb. There was something that was intensely exciting for Loeb to plan these crimes and then to carry them out. And this ties in with his fantasy of being a master criminal. And they literally did start out in a small way, like cheating at cards with their friends. And then they were going out in the middle of the night and smashing in car windows. And then they were setting fires. And my best guess is that this eventually, they elevated the thrill. Richard Loeb elevated the thrill, and it got to be necessary for him to do more serious crimes to get the same thrill, to get the same excitement. And then it leads on to killing a small child. And the role of Nathan, of course, if you're a master criminal, there's no real fun in doing these crimes by yourself. I mean, who's going to applaud? You know, who's going to say, oh, what a wonderful act of genius doing this fantastic crime? So Nathan Leopold is like the audience for Richard Loeb, but Nathan Leopold tags along in all of these crimes as a willing accomplice because he's the slave to Richard Loeb. His fantasy is to be a slave to a king. And Richard Loeb is his king and Nathan is the slave. And it's all in great detail in the psychiatric reports as how what kind of thrill Nathan gets from being a slave. He's like a powerful slave who can fight on behalf of the master, but he's also always submissive to his king, to the master. So it's this whole kind of complicated thing that leads them to this crime. And it's a very extraordinary thing, you know. I mean, I don't think there's a comparable criminal case like this in the whole of the American history.
It's just fascinating. So to move the story along a little bit, after they met, and then they got to the crime of wanting to steal at the fraternity in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. And it was about a 5-hour drive between Chicago and Ann Arbor. And so it sounds like from my read of the book, that this is the first evidence that you found where the two of them actually had an open conversation and negotiated the intimate relationship between the two of them. If you have that in front of you, can you read that portion of the book?
I can, yes. And this is, so they go from Chicago to Ann Arbor to Michigan. The significance of this, in fact, in the whole picture is that they steal a typewriter at the fraternity house. They take the typewriter back with them to Chicago, and that typewriter is used as evidence because they typed a ransom note on that typewriter. What I'll do is, and so after they're at Ann Arbor, they drive back to Chicago, and on the journey back from Ann Arbor, from the University of Michigan, they discuss the relationship that they're going to have between the two boys. And part of the problem is that Nathan is very upset that he's not getting enough sex with Richard. All right, so this is the beginning on page 59. Nathan was especially aggrieved that they too rarely had sex together. In the early days of their friendship, Richard had willingly slept with him, but in the 6 months that Richard had graduated from Michigan to move back to Chicago, they had only infrequently had sex. Why, Nathan demanded, should he continue to participate in Richard's schemes if Richard continued to hold him at arm's length? Richard knew he could not afford to lose Nathan's friendship. The other boy now had too much on him. They're doing these crimes, you know, so he could never entirely trust Nathan to keep his confidences. If their friendship dissolved, Nathan might tell the world of Richard's crimes and misdemeanors. And if word ever got back to his father about, say, that time when he had burned down that hut, or even worse, that other occasion when he had burglarized that house, then who knew what might happen? Richard was afraid of his father, afraid of the punishment that Albert Loeb would visit on his head if he found out that Richard had been misbehaving. So Richard broke the silence. Would Nathan be happier if they reached some sort of formal agreement? How would Nathan feel, for example, if they agreed to have sex a certain number of times, proportional perhaps to the frequency of their criminal adventures? Or why not just continue as before, Richard suggested, with the promise that they have sex together 3 times every 2 months? It was not a particularly generous offer, but to Richard's surprise, Nathan accepted readily. It gave a guarantee that their friendship would continue. Nathan had always dreaded the thought that one day, without warning, Richard would again suddenly end the friendship. This was an event too terrible to contemplate. This compact between them gave Nathan what he desired most of all, an assurance that Richard would continue as his friend. And then they go on the drive back from Michigan. They talk about the crime and how they're going to make it and so on and so forth. I can actually say a little bit about that. Read this paragraph at the bottom of the page. As he outlined his idea for the perfect crime, Richard steadily grew more excited. They should kidnap a child, he proposed, and to increase the intricacy of the crime, they should demand a ransom from the child's parents. The money was important, not for its own sake, but to magnify the complexity of the crime. They would have to leave directions in order to obtain the ransom, but they must make sure that they left no clues for the police. They would have to kill the child, of course. It would be foolish to leave open the possibility that their victim might recognize them at a later date. Had Richard a particular child in mind, Nathan asked. There were many wealthy families living in Kenwood and Hyde Park whose sons attended the Harvard School, and some of the children at University High School also had wealthy parents who would pay any ransom they asked. And Nathan goes on about he wants to kidnap a girl, but Richard is determined. I'm not quite sure why, but Richard says no, a boy. And then when it comes to the actual kidnapping and murder, they drive around in a car for like 2 or 3 hours looking for a child by himself. They're about to give up because all of the children are leaving school in groups, and they're about to give up when suddenly they see a little boy on the other side of the road. This boy is called Bobby Franks, and he's actually a cousin of Richard Loeb. And they know this boy, so they lure him to the car. They're in the car. They get him into the front seat of the car, and this boy is sitting in the front seat, and he's thinking he's with his cousin in the back seat, and this other boy in the front seat driving the car. And then Richard, they send this ransom note to the parents, but of course, before they do that, they kill the child immediately. As soon as they've got the little boy in the car, they kill him. They dump the body. They drive around with the body because it's daylight, and then at night they dump the body in the ditch. They go home, they write the ransom note, and then the parents receive the ransom note, and it's a demand for $10,000. And the trick is to get this. The trick is to get this $10,000 without being caught. How do you do that?
Yes, and so part of the plan, of course, as you described the boys' plan, there were 2 parts of it as far as I remember. One was they didn't want the body to be found in the beginning. They had found a culvert which they thought that the body could be hidden in, and that I believe they thought that the body would decompose and so it would never be found. And then the other part was, as you say, that it was important for them to get the ransom money. Not because they wanted or needed the $10,000. Either one of them could have gotten $10,000 from either of their families, I assume, at any time.
Right.
It was to prove their mastery of the crime. They needed to be able to perfect it. So remind our audience again how their plan, I believe it involved letting the father know and what to do with the $10,000 and putting it in a cigar box and going from one place onto a train and it being thrown off, and tell them how they were supposed to drop off the $10,000.
Yes, they left directions for the father to go to a pharmacy, a store where there was a telephone. They then told the father to get on the train, which was like an elevated train on the Illinois Central Railroad. And this train goes south and then goes east and ends up in Boston. But so the plan is they would say to the father, when the father gets the message, get on the train. When you see this sign that says Champion Manufacturing, throw the box, the cigar box with the money, off the train. And of course, they're waiting underneath the train. And they would pick up the cigar box and they would then be off. And the thing is that I think I missed out something. So the father is told, get on the train, get on this train, the 3 o'clock train leaving from the station, and then go to the last carriage and find a note that we leave in the last carriage. And this note tells the father to throw the cigar box at a certain point when he sees this big sign. And so this is kind of a full process, right? Because the police, they won't know if they get on the train. Let's suppose the police get on the train with the father. They won't know until they're on the train and the train is going of the second note, which tells them to throw the money off the train. And so the police will be on the train, but they won't be down on the street to catch the kidnappers. So it could have all worked, you know. I mean, if they had never discovered the body, which was a complete fluke that they did discover the body, but if they'd never discovered the body, they would have got the money, and presumably they would have got away with the $10,000. But absolutely, as you say, they had absolutely no need for $10,000 in any case. You know, $10,000, by the way, in our money is probably about $100,000 now, all right, in 2020. So, but they had no need for the money. I mean, families were incredibly wealthy, you know, millionaire families, and they had plenty of money.
So this happened in 1924. What month? What was it again where this happened?
Oh, I think this was April or May.
That's what I remember. That's where I remember too, that it was in the spring.
Yeah.
Then how long of a period of time was there between the time the ransom was dropped off and the time they were arrested?
Well, in fact, the ransom was never dropped off.
Okay.
Because before the father got on the train, they found that the body in the ditch was actually the boy's body.
Correct. Yes, sorry.
So what was this other question you asked? What was the question?
So between the time the ransom was supposed to be dropped off, how long was it before they were arrested?
Oh, I think it's probably a few days. It was probably about 10 days or 2 weeks. I'm not really sure. But the clue was the eyeglasses, you know.
Yes.
As soon as they got, and so they contact the company in Brooklyn. As soon as the company in Brooklyn says, we have only sold four of these eyeglasses in the whole of Cook County, then it becomes quite easy to find out who they sold them to and to contact those people.
Of course. So what do we know about the period of time in those 10 days about the relationship between the boys?
Well, I think they were both very, very confident. I mean, they were the kinds of people who just had Richard at least, he had so much self-confidence, and they were both so assured that they were never going to get caught. And in fact, Richard was, of course, the police were all over the place, you know, and so Richard would be hanging around the police while they were making inquiries, while they were walking. I mean, I can't remember the exact scene, but people noticed that Richard was around, but still nobody would have ever have suspected that. I mean, this was not something that wealthy young boys did and smart, intelligent boys did, and it just went against the grain of everything that anybody believed in the 1920s about crime.
Yes. And so then they were arrested approximately 10 days later. And then from the time that they were arrested, what do we know about the relationship between the two of them? They were both in jail. Presumably there was no physical relationship from that point forward. But what do we know about the relationship between the two of them? How much interaction, communication, collaboration did they have during the period leading up to the hearing?
Well, the state's attorney is Robert Crowe, was very, very smart, very clever, very experienced, and he actually held them separately in separate places. And then his men interrogated each boy. And what he would do the moment one of them said any details about the crime or began to confess, he would then go to the other boy and say, look, Nathan is telling us everything and he's blaming you. And so then Richard would say, yes, I did it, but he would blame Nathan. So each boy was blaming the other. And eventually, so then they both confess to everything. He then brings them into the station house together in the same room with the psychiatrist, the prosecution psychiatrist. And he says to one of the boys, I think it was Richard, now tell us everything you know about the crime. And then he says to Nathan, why don't you take notes on what Richard is saying? And so he does this with each boy, says, tell us what you know and take notes. Why did he do that? Because he wants evidence. He then takes those notes that each boy has said and he will use them. He's holding them in reserve to use them for the courtroom hearing. They're both kept in Cook County Jail, which was in downtown Chicago. They had a lot of access to the press, and the press could easily interview them before they come to the hearing. And basically then Clarence Darrow comes in with his psychiatrist and gets them to agree to what he's going to do in the courtroom. And the big problem for the families is that not only are the two boys willingly confessing their guilt, but they're not expressing any remorse. And in fact, one of them says, if I could do it again, I would do it again. I mean, I would do it again. You know, so there's no public sympathy. Everybody in Chicago wants them to be hung. And so the job that defense has is very, very tricky. How do I get them off the death penalty and get them to have life in prison? And the fact that Darrow succeeds that is kind of an amazing thing. And of course, he's the same lawyer the following year in 1925, he did the Scopes trial, which is probably his most famous trial, which is the evolution trial in the state of Tennessee. So,
yeah, of course, a very famous trial. Do you have any sense at the time that with all of the public attention on the murder and the arrest and things leading up to that hearing, that in the press, there was a degree of a relationship or some kind of homosexual connection between the two individuals? Was this part of the story that played out in the papers?
no, just almost nothing. I mean, there was just nothing. And the reason for that, of course, is that it was completely prohibited to even mention homosexuality in 1924. I read probably hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles. I read as much as I possibly could over the years and never did the word homosexual come up. And I think one newspaper very, very briefly hinted, but that was what it was. It was completely out of the picture.
Yeah.
And
Which is interesting to me, at least, in the sense that there was certainly a part in American culture where homosexuality would be conceived or considered to be a depraved mind, and therefore criminality could be associated with homosexuality, or vice of some type could be associated with it. But perhaps it was classism, that the classism in the sense that these were rich kids and they weren't going to call them out as being gay at the time.
yeah, I think that the subject was so hidden that whoever it would have been, I don't think there would have been any mention. The only mention of it, and then it was indirect, was after the sentencing, that Robert Crowe was very upset that they had got away with life, and he issued a statement calling them perverted, calling them degenerate. And I interpreted that statement as almost like a call to lynch them.
Yeah.
You know, here they were in Chicago, in Cook County Jail, and they had to go to the middle of the state to Joliet, which is quite a way away from Chicago. And he was saying, here they are, they got away with murder. They had never said sorrow, no remorse. And on top of it all, they're degenerates, you know, which is the word he used. So it was almost like it was a call to lynch them. So, but that was the only mention.
Yeah. And so the one that was killed in prison, any idea about the circumstances surrounding his death? Was it a death? Well, and as you say, he lived for a while, but was there any homophobia associated with, or that you had found evidence of associated with his death?
Well, again, it's still hidden. This was 1935, so it's still really not a subject that's discussed in public. And but what happened, of course, is that the young man who was 21 who killed Richard Loeb in the shower, and he stabbed Loeb 56 times, 56, which is just amazing. I mean, mind-boggling, all right? And of course, we don't have Richard Loeb's account of what happened. But the young man said that I was lured into the shower by this. I'm just presuming this is what he said in court. I don't have the transcript of this, but his defense must have been that I was attacked by this other man, and I defended myself and I stabbed him, and he was found not guilty, and he got away with the murder of Richard Loeb. Nobody in the prison was willing to come and testify about this case, because of course, if you're a prisoner testifying about anything that Richard Loeb did or about anybody did in the prison, and if this young man who killed Richard had been sent to the electric chair, then whoever testified would have gone back to the prison and would have had to face the wrath of the other prisoners. So it just wasn't going to happen.
So not to put words in your mouth, but do you think that there was enough evidence to at least think it was possible that Richard Loeb came on to this young man in the shower, and that's what led to the stabbing? Or do you think it was something that the young man had premeditated, that he had some issues with Richard Loeb?
Well, there's really no way to tell that, because the only person we have is the young man. He comes he's the only person that's still alive, and he gives his an account that he hopes will acquit him, which is what it did. So we really have to go with that account. I mean, but it's a reasonable thing. I mean, I don't know. Richard Loeb certainly had a lot of money inside the prison. He was getting lots of money from his brothers, and his parents were sending him money. And so he could bribe a lot of people in the prison. He didn't have to wear prison uniforms. He could eat his meals in his cell. He had a lot of privileges that the other prisoners didn't have, because he was bribing the guards. So was he bribing other prisoners for sex, or was he using his position in that way? It's not really possible to know very clearly, although, obviously we have the newspaper accounts.
Sure. Yeah. So we only have just a few more minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, now's the time to throw some additional ones up here. But before we get to those, so you wrote this book. I think the book was first published in what, 2008, 2009?
Yes, 2008.
2008. And obviously you spent a long time researching it. So as you've thought back on this book, as you've watched society changed, and as you've thought about this whole story between these two individuals, what have you been struck with as you think about it? You've invested a tremendous amount in the history of these two individuals, not just Leopold and Loeb, but certainly the poor boy who lost his death, or the young man who ended up killing one of them, and everybody else. What have you learned and sort of thought back upon with this?
I don't think that I always hesitate to draw any lessons from the past, and this was 100 years ago to the present, because it's such a different period. It's such a long time ago, and I don't know that there are any lessons. I mean, I think one of the obvious things is how different we live now compared to 1924. That we have these Supreme Court decisions, and it's a completely different atmosphere in a completely different context. That's one of the things that I would obviously, but that's a very obvious lesson to draw about this. I think just as a very minor thing, I think what I'm always struck by these criminal cases is the difference in how the courtroom is run. that of course nowadays you go in with an orange jumpsuit, there's all security all around you. And in those days it was far more informal. You would come in as though it was kind of a meeting. You know, you would be sitting there with your lawyer, there'd be no restraints on you, there'd be very little security. It was a very, very different atmosphere of criminal justice. So I think we did have a question about the eyeglasses.
Yes, one more question here about the eyeglasses. Somebody's screen froze. So if you could just one more time talk about the circumstances around the eyeglasses being found at the scene of or at the boy's body.
Yeah, in fact, in the book, I go into that, and that's a very important point because, you know, why would they be so dumb as to leave eyeglasses by the side of the ditch? And in fact, what happened was that they had the body, they were moving the body from the car to the ditch, and it was a warm night, and one of them took his jacket off when they were beginning to move the body to the ditch. And he leaves his jacket on the ground. And they're walking, they put the body in the ditch and they're walking back to the car. And then Nathan says to Richard, "Oh, I left my jacket behind. Do you mind picking it up?" He was the closest to the jacket. Richard picks up the jacket by one of the sleeves and the eyeglasses fall out of the jacket. And neither of them noticed that the eyeglasses have fallen out of the jacket. So it was just pure amazing chance that they happened to leave this clue, a very important clue, right at the scene of the crime, right by the body. So that's how it happened.
Yes, and as you say, it was a very easily traceable clue because the manufacturer in Brooklyn of those eyeglasses only sold 4 of them in Cook County. So it was a pretty easy thing to do. Simon, I can't tell you how enjoyable it's been to meet you and to have this chat with you. I thank you so much for bringing this wonderful detective novel, this sort of very scary story about what happened in real life. But also what's interesting is it is yet another story about how same-sex couples evolve and what the nature of the relationship is between the two of them. And I'm sort of left with the idea that there was at least some part of the relationship that was formed on the idea of the thrill, some kind of sadistic thrill that really sort of led to the relationship. And of course, that's not what most homosexual relationships or heterosexual relationships are about today. But clearly that is something that came out of the whole thing. The book, again, is The Thrill of It All, and it's available on paperback. Amazon and everybody have copies of it. If you've not picked it up, you can certainly come to the Stonewall Library, and we'll be happy to lend you ours. And it's been great to be able to talk to you about this. And so thank you very much for your time.
Oh, and I want to thank you as well. It's been very pleasant and enjoyable talking about a book that I did quite a while ago, and it's been good to revisit it and go over it again. Thank you.
Yes, no, very happy. So next week we don't have a program, but the following week after, Chris Boja, who is the director of the Fire Island Artist Residency, which is the only artist residency for visual artists and for writers exclusively devoted to the LGBTQ community. They've been around for 10 years. They are in Cherry Grove for the summer for 6 weeks. Some wonderful and amazing artists have been through that program. Chris, who is the director of the program, will be here talking about the need and the role that artist residencies programs play, and also how that impacts the creative process, and particularly the need for those within the gay and queer community to have a special place like that. So we're looking very forward to having Chris here. If you don't get our weekly newsletters, they have everything in them. You can go to stonewall-museum.org and you can sign up. We do now have 2 virtual exhibitions up right now. Both of them are about Pride marches. One, we've gone through our archives, and in our archives, we've actually pulled documents and records going back to 1972 from Pride marches from around the United States. A few weeks ago, we went through the archives, and in a pretty short period of time, I found evidence and documentation in 38 different states that show that from Oklahoma to Washington State to, of course, New York to every place. And so that exhibition is up on the website. And then also we have some great work on the website as well by a New York artist by the name of Stanley Steller, which documents what were originally known as the Christopher Street days, which were the early days of the Pride Parade in New York. And so he's documented it from, in the exhibition we have up now, from the late 70s and into the 80s. And so those black and white photographs, as well as a wonderful feature about Stanley Steller is there as well. That's all available to folks through our website at stonewall-museum.org. Broward County still will not let us open, even though we're showing up and going to work every day. We hope in the beginning of July, we will be able to open by then. The next live exhibition we're going to be doing is something called BLK, which is a publication that we have in our archives that ran between 1988 and 1994, based in Los Angeles. And it was a periodical, a monthly periodical that was designed exclusively for the Black gay male and Black lesbian communities then. And so there's wonderful interviews with Audre Lorde, with James Baldwin. There's even a great discussion about sexism and gay rights based upon a letter that Huey Newton wrote in 1970. And so it's a very rich publication for us to bring a lot of that history out. We cannot announce a date when that show is going to be up because we don't know when we're going to be open, but just know the minute we can get it available, we're going to put that exhibition up, and that will be up this summer. So again, we have lots going on, and if you have any suggestions of people who you want to hear or see in part of this series, just email us through the website. A recording of tonight's talk, as well as all the other past talks, can be found in the public programming section on our website. Give Emery about a week to get this one up, just so he has enough time. He's been very busy. And so I have to do a big shout out to our Deputy Director, Emery Grant, who is there somewhere. Emery, there you are. Hello, Emery, nice to see you. And so Emery has been behind the scenes making a lot of this stuff work. And so thank you, Emery, for all the great work that you do. And so until next time, not next week, but the week after, everybody stay safe, and hope to see you all. And Simon, again, many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.